You don't need a lot of fancy equipment to make really great coffee. If you use a drip machine, as long as it gets really hot and disperses the water over the coffee in an even and timely manner, you can have amazing coffee come out of it. However, if the thought of a manual brewing system at home is intriguing to you, this video is for you. I'm going to go over my home coffee setup. I'll talk about the equipment that I like to use, and as a coffee professional, maybe some of the reasons I chose them, and I'll even make some recommendations for other equipment that I have experience with. Let's get started. The thing that's going to make the biggest difference as far as quality goes at home is going to be grinding your beans right before you brew them. So my first recommendation is a grinder, and my favorite grinder for home is the Barista Encore. I've had my Barista for a few years now, and it hasn't missed a beat. With regular cleanings, I've never experienced it struggling or getting stuck or anything like that. And it's small and compact enough to where I just leave it on my kitchen counter. If you can swing it, I'd really recommend a grinder like the Barista that has burrs in it. In a burr grinder, the coffee travels through a set of burrs into the chamber. And in this way, the whole beans in the top are separated from the grounds in the bottom. This is opposed to a blade grinder, which is kind of like a mini blender. In a blade grinder, the blade will be in the hopper so that as it grinds the coffee, the particles at the bottom are going to get finer and finer before all of the coffee gets ground. This leads to a bit of an uneven grind and might taste a little bit funny in your coffee. I think the main competitor for the Barista that I would recommend is the Fellow Oat Grinder. It's a little bit more expensive, and I'm not sure I would notice a difference between the quality, but it looks really good on your counter, and it has a really smartly designed magnetic basket, which keeps things a lot more tidy. The next most important item is going to be for your consistency. That's a scale. I have a Hario V60 scale here. It's pretty simple. It just has an on, off, and tare button, and there's a timer built in so you can start and stop it. The other scale that's popular is the Akaya. It's probably the industry standard in cafes right now, and it works great and it's beautiful. It's quite pricey though, so I'm not gonna have it in my home setup, but if you have one of those, that's awesome. What makes it better other than looking better? It's really, really fast on giving you the weight of the brew. So if that matters to you, that's the one to get. Why do you need a scale? You want to be repeatable with your brewing if you're going to do manual brewing. And if you're going to be changing variables to try to improve the quality of your coffee, for example, maybe today you're going to change the grind setting, or you're going to try a different temperature of water, you're going to try a different way of pouring. If you're also changing the amount of coffee and the amount of water, you're not going to be able to make conclusions about what made a difference. So that's why a scale is super important. Next up, let's talk kettles. My kettle is a Kalita wave pot. I think it's called a wave pot. I always get them mixed up. I don't think it's the Kalita thin spout. I'm not sure. I'll have pictures of them both here. This is called a gooseneck kettle because of this shape here. And it just helps you control the speed and direction of your pour. There's no heating element on this, so I actually use a little kettle that plugs into the wall. It's super simple, but I transfer it from here into the gooseneck before I brew. This is definitely not the most popular kettle on the market, I think. For a long time, it was the Hario Buono kettle. That's the one that kind of looks like it reminds me of the caterpillar from Bug's Life or the Michelin Man. I think the kettle I see most often is the Stag EKG from Fellow, the same company that makes the Oat Grinder. They are really beautiful pieces of design. Plus the electronic version plugs into the wall and heats up really quickly. It's just very slick. However, I don't like how slow the water comes out of the spout on those. If I can, I'd like to control the flow rate of the water in my wrist rather than be too limited as far as max speed. There's a pro and con in that. I think some people like that they can just pour it full and it'll be consistent the whole time, but I would prefer a little bit more control. Very, very fancy, very beautiful on your counter. If you had that next to an ode, I can see the appeal for sure. And finally, we're going to talk about the brewer. So I use an origami brewer, which is this purple thing here. And I use Cleta 185 filters to go into the origami. You can get the origami from Slow Pour Supply. Full disclosure, there are friends in town. They're also based around Houston. They're the main distributor of the origami in the US. The biggest thing I don't like about the origami is the stand it comes with. It has a stand that's kind of a circle, and it doesn't like cut into these grooves at all. So you can kind of spin the brewer inside there, and I don't like. Number one, I'm gonna drop it, or I'm gonna knock it over. And number two, I don't want to get the level out every time I brew. So I actually just throw it in this carafe. This one is from Target, but it's just a Chemex copy. So even when I brew it at the roastery, I throw the origami into a Chemex. So other than the origami, there's the V60, the Cleta 185. I really like my metal Cleta because you can throw it in your backpack and not be worried about it. It's tough. And of course the Chemex. If you want to experiment with an AeroPress, that's really fun. That's a small plastic tube that you push the water through the coffee to get a bit more extraction. And then if you want to have a simpler, less fussy way to make coffee at home with still kind of manual, you can go with a French press or a Clever, which is a really cool design where you pour water into the top of it and it fills up, and there's a stopper at the bottom, and it just brews until you put it on top of a cup. But notice the brewer is the last piece of kit that I'm talking about. As long as it's a relatively popular brewer and the design of it makes sense to you, you're not going to see huge changes between the different brewers, especially between an origami, a Cleta, and a V60. You'll notice a difference with a Chemex because the filter is so thick that your coffees are going to be more delicate tasting, which can be really a good choice for a more delicate coffee to pick out some of the more nuanced flavors. And then a French press is going to be much bolder, much richer because the filter on that is the opposite of a Chemex. It lets sediment through. So your cup is going to be a little bit thicker and a bit more bitter and give you less ability to suss out the different notes. Before I end, I want to talk about some of the things I like to drink out of. My favorite thing ever to drink out of is this coffee cup from Box Sparrow. And it has a little lid. It's super fancy. And the reason I like it, it's a very similar design to the origami cups, but those don't have lids. And this was a gift from my wife. She bought 3 of these for me when I went to compete in the Brewers Cup. There was one in Austin and one in Nashville. So I competed with these. I really wanted to, in my routine, have the judges lift the lid while they were smelling because you can get a really intense aroma from that. And that was just part of my routine. But it's just sentimental for me at this point. It is the best thing I can drink coffee out of, but also it makes me think of competing and my wife. So there's that. If you want something more like readily available, I also really like drinking out of these tiny, I think these are the Cortado size from Fellow. Just a fantastic way to drink coffee. I like drinking coffee out of small vessels and leaving most of the coffee in the pot. It stays hotter that way. I don't mind going back to the pot over and over. So those are my 2 recommendations for that. All right, that's my setup. I'd love to hear what you guys are brewing with at home. Do you go through all the trouble of making your coffee manually? Do you have a drip machine that you really like? Are you using a single cup brewer? Or are you making espresso at home? It's a whole other can of worms. If you were wondering how to make espresso at home, we'll definitely make a video on that. But that is much more difficult and maybe part of the reason why you know, we're keeping baristas and coffee shops alive, because yeah, that takes some skill as well. But still doable, still accessible, and we hope we can make it accessible. But yeah, different video. So thanks again. This is Chris Porto. I'm with Many Worlds Tavern. We make coffee for game night. So after I move all of this stuff, I'm going to play some Letter Jam with some friends. Cheers and happy gaming.